Welcome back to this lecture series for ethics. In this video we continue our discussion of the ethics of Immanuel Kant. And you'll recall that in our previous video we looked at the following example as a way of explaining the difference between categorical and hypothetical imperatives. We said imagine that you are in a job interview and you're sitting there and you're telling yourself, I know that there is some lie that if it was believed by the interviewers would really improve my chances of getting this job. And so you ask yourself the following question. Should I tell this lie? Ought I lie in this job interview? And the point I was making last time is that that question is actually somewhat ambiguous. There are really two different things you might mean when you ask yourself, should I lie in this job interview? On the one hand, you might be asking yourself, will I be able to get away with lying during this interview? Will I get caught? Will they find out what I'm saying isn't true? And ultimately, will lying help me get the job or will it hinder me from getting the job? And that's one kind of question that you can ask, and we ask it all the time. It's a self-interested question. We ask, will taking this job, will going to this school, will forming a relationship with this person be good for me, or will it not be good for my interests? And the point is that when you're asking that kind of question, you are asking a question about hypothetical imperatives. You're saying to yourself, given that my goal is to attain the job, will lying further that goal or will it hinder that goal? And for Kant, while there's nothing wrong with thinking in terms of hypothetical imperatives, in fact, we do it all the time, we have to think about, here's my goal, how do I get there? Well, that's perfectly okay to do. In some circumstances, it is entirely inappropriate because there are some actions in Kant's view which the rightness or wrongness of performing them doesn't depend upon whether they achieve a certain aim or further our interests. And lying is exactly one of those actions for Kant. And for that reason, he thinks in this circumstance, it's actually inappropriate about lying to ask, will it help me get the job? Because it's simply beside the point. In Kant's view, when you ask the question, should I lie during this job interview or lie during any other context? The question you should be concerned about is lying during a job interview a morally acceptable type of action? And because Kant is a moral absolutist, he thinks that there are certain actions which it is always wrong for us to perform. And lying, stealing, killing, those sorts of things, they all fall under those category of moral absolutes. And so his point is that when you are asking the question, should I lie during this job interview, you shouldn't be asking, will lying help me get the job? You should be asking, is there something inherently morally wrong about lying? Is lying in and of itself, apart from any consequences it will produce, is lying in and of itself an action that is permissible for me as a rational being to perform? And if you ask that question, then you are finally asking the question of determining a categorical imperative, and you're asking a question of morality. Now, of course, even if we accept all that, there's still a major question that needs to be resolved, namely, how do we know that lying is actually inherently morally wrong? What are the categorical imperatives? How do we determine what a categorical imperative would tell us to do or tell us not to do? And on this point, Kant provides us the following principle, which I'm going to call the principle of the categorical imperative, and which essentially will allow you to generate or determine those absolute moral rules that we ought to follow. So what is the principle? Kant tells us, there is therefore only a single categorical imperative. Now what does that mean? Does that mean there's only one moral rule? What about the many moral rules like don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't murder? What about all those? Those are all moral rules. He's just saying that there is one overall moral principle from which all those rules are derived. And that principle is the following. Act only according to that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. Now in a moment we're going to get into more detail into what this means, but at first we should just think about in general what is the meaning of this statement and why should we care about this principle. The principle is essentially saying only act in those ways that it would be acceptable for everyone to act. only act on a personal rule of action that you would think could be a universal moral law for everybody. And we should begin by just reflecting on, why does that matter? Why does it matter that we act in ways that we're only comfortable with everyone else acting? Well, one way to think about it is this. Maybe at some point in your life, you have done a group project. And now, so group projects, I guess they have their virtues, but also they have their distinct disadvantages, because inevitably, let's say you're in a group with 4 people, inevitably there will be one person probably who just doesn't pull their weight. They reason to themselves as follows: yes, I could do my part, but I realize that the other 3 people in my group are motivated to want to get a good grade, and I realize that I can just sort of free ride on their efforts and also get a good grade without doing anything. Now, suppose you're in this situation. This will obviously make you extremely annoyed, extremely angry at this person, extremely resentful because they're not doing their part. And you might say, well, how can I explain to this person why this is wrong? Because again, if all that really matters is getting what you want, is saying, well, will not doing my part be enough to get an A, or will it not? And if you say, well, my rest of my group members will pick up the slack, it's enough to get me an A, you might say, well, why do I have to do my part? From Kant's point of view, here's what you would say. Where do you begin? Why do you think that you can consider yourself to be so special that you don't have to do your part? Why do you think it's okay that you can be the one who doesn't do anything while everyone else takes on the burden of doing the project to the best of their ability? The idea is that those who are free riders, those who don't act as they should and who expect everyone else instead to act in an appropriate way, they are free riding, they are using the efforts of everybody else. And think about getting that mindset. To be in that mindset, you would have to say, yes, it's fine for me to act this way. It's fine for me to slack off and not do what I'm supposed to do. But it's not okay for everyone else. And if that's the way you're thinking, then what you should ask yourself, and what the other group members should confront this person about, is, what makes you so special? Why do you get to follow a different set of rules than everyone else? That fundamentally is what lies behind this principle. What Kant is going to tell us is that there are certain actions, such as lying, which if you act in that way, you must be assuming that everyone else is not lying. And that makes you what? A free rider, a parasite, someone who is using the honest efforts of others to get what they want. Ultimately, it's someone who's acting in a way that not everyone else could act, who's following their own set of rules, which seem to assume that they are unique and special and don't have to act in the way that is required of everyone else. So with that general understanding in place of the principle of the categorical imperative, let's take a more detailed look at some of the terms within it so we can get a more specific understanding. So again, the principle says, act only according to that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. So what does that mean? So first, what does the term maxim mean? A maxim is just a personal rule of action that you're going to use in a given situation. So what might be some maxims? Well, whenever I have an exam coming up later in the week, I will study. Whenever I am hungry, I will go to the store to get groceries. Whenever I feel myself becoming angry at my significant other, I will count to 10 and try to calm myself down. Right? These are all personal rules for action. Or you might say, whenever I need to get up early at 5 a.m., I will set 15 alarms or something. Right? These are all personal rules of action that you might use in your day-to-day life to get you to your desired ends. Okay, so that's a maxim, and what is he telling us? So the principle of the categorical imperative is telling you that some maxims are okay to act upon, while other maxims are not okay to act upon. And what are the maxims that are okay to act upon? Only those maxims that you would say you would will to be a universal law for everybody. And what does Kant mean by universal law? We'll go all the way back to the foundation of Kant's theory. The universal laws that he's referring to are those absolute moral laws, which he called the laws of freedom, which hold for all rational beings, which must be followed by everyone, and through which we become free and autonomous by following. So essentially what he's saying is, what maxims can we act upon permissibly? Only those that we would find it acceptable for everybody to act upon as maxims. So now let's return to the original scenario. You're thinking about lying during a job interview, and you are saying to yourself, should I lie or should I not lie? So now we can say, here's the question you should be asking. So what's your maxim? Your maxim is, whenever I need to get a desirable job opportunity, then I will lie if doing so will help me. That's the maxim you're thinking about. And so now these are the sort of questions you should be asking if you care about Kant's categorical imperative. Is lying during this job interview an action that I can will merely as a personal rule for action? Or is lying during a job interview an action that I can will as a permissible way of acting for everyone? So this maxim you have of when I need to get the job, I will lie, is that a rule that only you could follow? Is it a rule that could only be a personal rule for action? Or is it also a way that you would find it acceptable and it would be consistent and coherent for everybody to follow? These are the crucial questions. And ultimately what Kant is going to say is that if the way you're thinking about acting is only acceptable as a personal rule for action, and is not acceptable as a universal law for everybody to follow, then you should never perform that action. It's never okay for you to act in that way. And why is that? Well, think about what we just said. For you to act in a way that only you personally could act, for you to act on a maxim that would only work as a personal rule, makes you like the person not pulling their weight in the group project. You're acting by your own set of rules that not everyone could follow. And if you're the only one that could follow them, then again, you seem to be saying, I'm unique, I'm special, I don't need to follow the rules for everyone else. And you end up being a parasite or a free rider on the good and honest efforts of the rest of the community of human beings and the rest of the community of rational beings. Now, thus far, I think a lot of what Kant says here makes sense. We do have a deep intuition that there's something unfair about people acting by their own sets of rules. But there's still something further to be explained. What does Kant mean when he says that not everybody could act according to a maxim where it's okay to lie? Why can't everybody lie? Why is lying not a rule that can be put in place for everyone? And to illustrate and understand this point, Kant actually takes us through a couple of examples using the principle of the categorical imperative. And I'm going to take you through one of those examples here. And actually he gives us a test to determine whether something is a permissible action and we're allowed to do it, or whether it's something that we can never perform and is prohibited by the categorical imperative. And this is very simply called the categorical imperative test, or the CI test. And all it's meant to be is just an expression of this principle of the categorical imperative. So what is the test? Well, here are the steps. First, step 1, formulate your maxim. So what is the personal rule for acting in this situation? And it's going to include the action you're proposing to perform and sort of the motivation or the reason you're doing it. So previously we said, look, my maxim is whenever I need to get a desirable job opportunity, then I will lie to do so. That would be a personal rule for action. Whenever I need to wake up at 5 a.m., I will set 15 alarms. That's another personal rule for action. So the first step is formulate your maxim, right? What is the personal rule that you're proposing you're going to follow in this situation? Step 2, universalize your maxim, right? In step 1, you're just saying, here's my personal rule that I'm going to follow. But step 2 requires you now to imagine that this wasn't just a personal rule that was going to be followed by you, but it's a universal rule that's going to be followed by all rational beings. That's the second step. So you imagine this. It's not just a personal rule, it's a rule for everyone. Step 3, once you've universalized your maxim, you've imagined a world in which everybody's going to follow this rule, then you ask, is that world possible? Is it possible to have a world in which all rational beings were permitted to act in the way that I am about to act? And this is where you determine if the action is morally permissible or morally impermissible. If such a world is possible, if you can imagine a world in which everybody is going to act in the way you're about to act, then you would say, yeah, it's morally permissible to act in that way. And most actions are going to be like this, right? You can think of plenty of examples. You might say, here's an example. It's sort of a silly one, but it gets the point across. Whenever I'm feeling tired, I'm going to sit down. Okay, so that's my personal rule for action. I universalize it. I imagine everyone, when they feel tired, is going to sit down. And does there seem to be any incoherency, any contradiction, any impossibility in everyone following that action? Well, no. So it's a perfectly fine thing to do, and no one would expect otherwise. But more interesting for our purposes is the other option. In some cases, Kant is going to say that in some sense, when you universalize certain maxims, the world that you imagine simply is not possible. That it's impossible for that personal rule of action to serve as a universal rule for action. And if that is the case, if your personal rule cannot be universalized, then Kant will say you are never morally permitted to act upon that maxim. It is a kind of action which is inherently morally wrong in and of itself, precisely because not everyone could act in that way. Now, to better understand the CI test, or the categorical imperative test, I'm going to go through one of the examples that Kant uses, and I'm going to call this the false promising case. So here's the situation. Kant tells us that there's a person who sees himself pressured by need to borrow money. He knows full well that he will not be able to repay, but also sees that nothing will be lent to him unless he solemnly promises to repay it at a determinate time. So we see someone who desperately needs money. He knows that if he makes a promise to pay back a loan he might get, he will not be able to repay it, but he doesn't see any other way of getting the money. Kant continues on. He feels like making such a promise, but he still has enough conscience to ask himself, is it not impermissible and contrary to duty to help oneself out of need in such a way? Suppose that he's still resolved to do so. Now, the question is, so let's say this person has decided they're going to make this false promise about paying back a loan, which they know they will never repay. They're going to say, look, yeah, you give me this amount of money, I'll definitely pay you back, knowing full well that will never happen. What would the maxim of their action be? Kant tells us his maxim of the action would go as follows. When I believe myself to be in need of money, I shall borrow money and promise to repay it, even though I know it will never happen. So the maxim just is, look, whenever I need money, I'm going to make a false promise, and I'm never even going to have the intention of paying that money back. So this is just the first step of the categorical imperative test. Formulate your maxim, which is what I just read from you to you from that passage. Now the second step, as we said, is to universalize the maxim. And so let's see what Kant says about this part of the test. So after he's formulated this maxim, whenever I need money, I'm going to make a false promise and I'm not going to repay it. Then Kant continues on, now this principle of self-love or of one's own benefit is perhaps quite consistent with my whole future well-being. So what Kant is saying is, look, it might very well be the case that if you're only concerned with your self-interest or doing what's best for you, maybe this would work out. Now maybe it wouldn't work out many times in the future, right? Maybe it'd only work out once because people wouldn't trust you. But he says, look, it's quite consistent with my future well-being that there could be a case where I can make a false promise and benefit from it. But what Kant says is that's not the question. He says the question now is whether it is right. Remember, we're not asking about a hypothetical imperative, we're asking about a categorical imperative, the imperative of morality. He says, I therefore transform the imposition of self-love into a universal law. I transform my personal rule of action into a rule for everyone and arrange the question as follows. How things would stand if my maxim became a universal law? So step 2 asked you to imagine a world in which it was perfectly acceptable for anyone to make a false promise whenever they needed to get money, or maybe whenever they needed to get any other sort of benefit for themselves. So that's step 2. We're imagining everyone is going to follow this personal rule of action that I've legislated for myself. Step 3 is the most important and also most difficult part of the test to understand. Remember, the third step says, look, if there's some contradiction or impossibility in this being a universal law, you can never act on that maxim. If there's no impossibility, no contradiction, then you can act on it. What Kant is going to say is that there is a certain impossibility in a world in which everyone is allowed to make a false promise. There is some contradiction there. And so you're never allowed to make a false promise for any reason or under any circumstance. The trick just is determining or trying to understand, what does Kant think that contradiction is? So let's see what Kant says. Now, I then see at once that it can never hold as a universal law of nature and harmonize with itself, but must necessarily contradict itself. So he says this maxim, once it's universalized, has to necessarily contradicts itself. It undermines itself in some way. Now, why is that? For the universality of a law that everyone, once he believes himself to be in need, could promise whatever he fancies with the intention not to keep it, would make the promise and the end one may pursue with it itself impossible, as no one would believe he was being promised anything, but would laugh about any such utterance as vain and pretense. Okay, now, what is he saying here? It's easy to misinterpret the point Kant is making here, and it's a common mistake that students will make. So first, here is what Kant isn't saying. Now, you'll notice that Kant says, look, in a world where anyone can make a false promise, if you tried to make a promise to someone, people would laugh in your face. And that's true. If you knew that everyone was allowed to make a false promise, you would never believe anyone when they promised you something. And so you might say, well then, okay, I get it. The reason that Kant thinks false promising is wrong is because it would have bad consequences for society. If we couldn't make promises with one another, we couldn't conduct business, we couldn't have flourishing interpersonal relationships, we couldn't have government structures that work effectively insofar as they work on agreement. Right? If you think about the number of things in life that are based on promises and based on this idea that people are going to do in the future what they say they're going to do now, it's easy to see how society would fall apart. And I think that's right. But that isn't the reason Kant says false promising is wrong. Because that is consequentialist reasoning. That's utilitarian reasoning. That would be to say, look, false promising is wrong because if everyone did it, there would be disastrous consequences for society. But no, that's not what he says. The crucial clause here is that this maxim would make the promise and the end one may pursue with it itself impossible. The idea is that in a world where everyone was allowed to make a false promise, the strategy you yourself are trying to enact would no longer be possible. You could not carry it out. To see why, consider this. You say, look, okay, I'm going to get the money I need by making a false promise. Okay, now in a world where anyone's allowed to make a false promise, where there's no expectation that people are going to keep their promises, then when you make a promise to pay the money back, as Kant says, the person will laugh in your face. Your whole strategy will no longer work because the person's not going to believe what you're saying in the first place. And what does this show? This shows that making a false promise only works if everyone else, or mostly everyone else, is keeping their word. Making a false promise could only possibly benefit you if there's an expectation that people are going to keep their promises, do what they say, and hold by their word. And that means that to make a false promise makes you like the free rider who doesn't do their part in a group project. The only way your strategy can be successful is if everyone's doing their part and you are the only one who isn't. Everyone else is doing their part by being honest, not telling lies, keeping their promises, and you are going around trying to take advantage of that by telling false promises that exploit and take advantage of the honesty and goodwill of everyone else. But notice, there would be no honesty, there would be no expectation of honesty to take advantage of if we lived in a world where everyone was allowed to make a false promise. And so Kant's point is not, in fact, that a world where everyone made false promises would be a bad world, although it would be a bad world. His point is that in such a world, your strategy would be impossible for you to enact. If you're the sort of person that wants to get by making false promises and deceiving people, you can only be successful if everyone else is being honest. And what that means is that to tell a lie, to make a false promise, seems to assume on your part that you're unique, you're special, and you get to follow a certain set of rules that not everyone else gets to follow. So given this, we see that Kant has a rather extreme view of lying. Because what is wrong with lying isn't the consequences of some specific lie, it's something about the nature of lying itself and how it can't be universalized. That means it doesn't matter what the reason is you're lying. You can never tell a lie under any circumstance, in any situation, for any reason. And so we see Kant, and this isn't from the groundwork which you read, but in a famous essay entitled On a Supposed Right to Lie from Philanthropy, Kant tells us that to be truthful or honest in all declarations is therefore a sacred command of reason prescribing unconditionally, one not to be restricted by any conveniences. And in that same essay, Kant responds to some criticism that was posed to him coming from the following hypothetical scenario. So let's imagine, for instance, that a friend of yours is hiding in your house and they suspect that there's someone, a murderer, who wants to kill them. And let's say that the person they suspect wants to kill them, right? So your friend's hiding in the basement, and the person they suspect wants to kill them comes to your door, knocks on the door, you answer it, and this person asks, "Is your friend in the house?" Kant holds that even there, you would have a obligation and a duty to tell the truth to this inquiring murderer. So, as Kant says, it would be a crime to lie to a murderer who asked us whether a friend of ours whom he is pursuing has taken refuge in our house. And of course, this is a hypothetical scenario, but it became much more concrete, and this scenario actually received much greater interest following World War II. And this is actually because many analogous situations just like this did occur, where people who were hiding Jews in their homes were asked by the Nazis whether there were any Jews there. And so as one commentator puts it, does Kant really mean to say that people hiding Jews in their houses should have told the truth to the Nazis? It seems that if you take what Kant is saying seriously, and you take the categorical imperative seriously, and you think that what makes lying is just the fact that lies can never be universalized, then you'd have to say that even in that case, for Kant, it would be morally wrong to tell a lie. And this is a very extreme view of lying. But ultimately, it does come from his moral absolutist point of view. What makes an action right or wrong isn't the consequences it produces, but it's something about the form of the action itself, and something about whether that action is an action that everybody could perform. Now, there's plenty of controversy about Kant's view of lying itself, and some people argue that maybe you can get around that problem by sort of formulating the maxim in a little different way. But I want to put that question to the side for a moment. And I want to bring up another interesting point about Kant's view of lying, or really what I would call his view of deception. So thus far we've been talking about lying, and roughly to tell a lie just means to say something false with the intention of getting someone to believe that false thing. Right? That's what a lie. You're just directly telling a falsehood to someone so they will believe it. But there's another way that you might deceive someone, right? There's another way that you might get someone to believe something that is false. And that's called misleading. And when you mislead someone, it's not quite like a lie. To mislead someone is when you say something that's actually true, but you say that true thing with the intent that the person will end up believing something that is false. And to understand this point, I want to look at the following example that came from a time when Kant himself used a misleading statement instead of a lie. So here's the example. In 1794, Kant was required by King Friedrich Wilhelm II, shortly before the latter's death, to refrain from any distortion or depreciation of Christianity. He knew that if he made public anything further of his thoughts on religion, as he hoped to do, he would be held guilty of just such distortion or depreciation, perhaps with baneful consequences. So the king says, look, Kant, you can't say anything else that depreciates the Christian religion. Kant had some complicated views on religion, so he was worried that if he published his works on religion, that he would in fact get punished under this law of distorting or depreciating Christianity. Now, he wanted to publish these works, so what did Kant do? Well, his moral system tells him he can't tell a lie, right? So he can't go to the king and say, okay, I'm definitely not going to publish, and then maybe find some way to publish under a pseudonym or something like that. So he can't tell a lie. But notice what Kant did in fact do. Kant therefore responded by making a declaration, "As your Majesty's faithful subject, that I shall in the future completely desist from all public lectures or papers concerning religion, be it natural or revealed." So what did Kant say? He said, well, look, as long as I'm your Majesty's faithful subject, I won't publish anything on religion. Now, if you think about how the king would have taken that statement, the king likely would have just looked at it and say, oh, okay, good, Kant has agreed to not publish anymore, so the matter is settled. But is that actually what Kant said? Did he say he was not going to publish on religion anymore? Well, no, he didn't actually say that. He said he wasn't going to publish on religion anymore as long as he was the Majesty's faithful subject. And it actually turned out that the king was close to death. So what did Kant do? He said, I won't publish on religion as long as the king is alive and I'm the king's subject. And as soon as the king in fact died, then he went about publishing his thoughts on religion. So you might say here, well, how is this not a lie? Well, Kant didn't say anything that was false. He said, as long as the king is alive, as long as I'm the Majesty's faithful subject, I won't publish on religion. Now, he said that knowing that the king might likely misinterpret it, that the king would think that therefore Kant was agreeing to never publish on religion. But that simply is not what Kant said. So this shows a couple of things. First, it shows that when you mislead, you say something literally true in an effort to get to someone. To make sure we understand the difference between lying and misleading, let's look at one other example. So this example is much more recent. It comes from some statements that former President Bill Clinton made about the sex scandal involving himself and Monica Lewinsky. And so this little excerpt comes from an interview from PBS's NewsHour that Jim Lehrer was doing with Clinton on January 21st, 1998. So Lehrer asks Clinton, he says, no improper relationship. Define what you mean by that. Clinton says, well, I think you know what it means. It means there's not a sexual relationship, an improper sexual relationship, or any other kind of improper relationship. Lehrer then attempts to clarify, you had no sexual relationship with this young woman? And Clinton responds, there is not a sexual relationship. That is accurate. Now, if you're extremely attentive to what Clinton is saying here, you'll notice he's attempting to evade the question because of course there was a sexual relationship, and that is what Lehrer is trying to get at. Notice his question is in the past tense. You had no sexual relationship with this young woman? Well, to say no to that would be a lie because of course we now know that there in fact was a sexual relationship. So how does Clinton respond? He says, well, notice he uses the present tense. There is not a sexual relationship. That is accurate. Now, what Clinton is attempting to do here is to engage in an act of misleading those who are watching this interview without actually lying. Technically and literally speaking, did Clinton say anything that's false? No, he was talking in the present tense. At that time, there was no sexual relationship, so he didn't lie. But he's clearly engaging in misleading. He's saying something is true, hoping that the audience will not be perceptive enough to notice it, and will ultimately come away with the false belief that there was never any sort of sexual relationship between him and Monica Lewinsky. So just like the previous case, this is a case of misleading because in it, the speaker says something that is true in order to get the audience to believe something that is false. Now, given that Kant thought it was always wrong to lie in any circumstance, but also given that Kant himself took pains to mislead in the instance that we talked about earlier, Kant must think that there's an important difference between lying and misleading. And because this is the case, we can say that Kant follows the traditional view of deception. And what is this view? I would describe it as the following. In cases which are otherwise similar in all relevant respects, it is always worse to lie than it is to mislead, even if both are morally wrong. So the traditional view just says that, look, even if it's wrong to lie and mislead, it is always going to be worse to tell a lie. And Kant's specific version of this is that lying is always morally wrong, but misleading, it could be morally wrong sometimes, but is not necessarily morally wrong. So we should think about, why is this? And ultimately the reason is going to have to be that lying is not universalizable, but misleading is universalizable. So why is this? So here I want to look at some comments that philosopher Michael Sandel makes on this point, but I think he has a nice explanation of why there's a difference between lying and misleading in terms of universalizability. So first he sums up the idea of Kant's idea of lying and why lying can't be universalized. If everyone lied when faced with a murder at the door and an embarrassing sex scandal, then no one would believe such statements and they wouldn't work, right? Just like we said with false promises, if we imagine a world where everybody lies, then it would be impossible to lie, and you can never derive any benefit from lying. So that your strategy would undermine itself, it would be impossible, it would lead to a contradiction. So again, that's why lying is always morally wrong. But why is misleading not necessarily always morally wrong? Here's how Sandel explains this point. If everyone who found himself in a dangerous or embarrassing situation resorted to carefully crafted evasions, people would not necessarily cease to believe them. Instead, people would learn to listen like lawyers and parse such statements with an eye to their literal meaning. This is exactly what happened when the press and the public became familiar with Clinton's carefully chosen words. So he's saying, look, imagine a world where everyone is constantly misleading each other, where the maxim, I'm going to mislead others to get what I want, is a universal law that everyone can follow. Now this might be essentially the world we almost live in, and I think we can all agree this is not an ideal world. Right, an ideal world would be one where everyone is more upfront with each other. But the question isn't whether this is the ideal world. The question just is there any fundamental contradiction in such a world where everybody is misleading each other? And the fundamental point is no. Right, we can imagine a world where everyone engages in misleading statements, and we all know that everyone's going to do this. And why would it work? Well, it would just require that the audience pay much more attention and become much more closely and clearly focused on the literal meaning of what people are saying. Because in any misleading instance, you could say, and this is usually the defense given, the responsibility is on the audience. When Kant said, look, I'm not going to publish on religion as your majesty's faithful subject, if the king had just been listening more carefully and interpreting more closely what Kant was saying, then the king could have derived the truth out of that statement. If when Bill Clinton said there is no sexual relationship, if the audience had been listening more closely and paying more attention and catching the shift from the past to the present tense, then they could have derived the truth out of that statement. So the idea is, when you're misleading, because you are literally telling the truth, and because the responsibility for believing what's false falls upon the audience, there's no contradiction there. We could run a society like that. We could have a human community where everyone was allowed to act on a maxim that you can mislead to get what you want. It may not be the ideal human community, but that is at least a universalizable maxim. But because lying is not universalizable, Kant thinks that is where the fundamental difference lies. To mislead does not necessarily mean you're taking advantage of the honesty of others. But to lie always means you are doing exactly that. And because you are doing exactly that, lying must always be morally wrong, whereas misleading is not necessarily always morally wrong.